The needle saved civilization. I stared at that line in the report, convinced it was a typo. On the desk in front of me lay a piece of steel wire, 4 centimeters long, a point, an eye. That was it. I had seen things that truly changed the world: fire, the wheel, writing. But a needle? No, I didn't buy it. So I decided to investigate the whole thing from the very beginning. The first theory surfaced immediately. The needle was for sewing clothes. If that were the case, the investigation could be closed right then and there. But a good detective doesn't just look for an answer. He looks for the flaw in his own answer. And I found one almost right away. If the needle saved humanity simply by allowing us to sew clothes, then why did the Neanderthals die out? They wore animal skins too. They also knew how to protect themselves from the cold. Where did they go wrong? I started comparing. Weapons, shelters, hunting tactics, nothing. The difference was so tiny, I almost missed it. Neanderthals just draped hides over their shoulders and tied them off with leather straps. On paper, that should have worked. But the Ice Age wind didn't give a damn. It found every gap. One sprint, the hide shifts, and your core temperature drops faster than your body can burn calories. Then the missing piece turned up. In Denisova Cave, one of the oldest bone needles on record. And there it was, the secret weapon that won the war for Homo sapiens. Sapiens didn't just wrap themselves in dead animals. They picked up a needle and started tailoring. They cut the leather and custom fitted it to their bodies. Sleeves, pants, hoods. The needle locked the heat in. It made the garments airtight. It turned a pelt into a prehistoric spacesuit. That's when it hit me. This needle wasn't just stitching leather. It was deciding the fate of human evolution. The case could have been closed right there. The needle helped humans survive the Ice Age. The theory was solid. But one detail derailed the whole thing again. The glaciers retreated. The climate grew milder. Deadly cold was no longer public enemy number 1. If the needle was purely a survival tool, its story should have ended right there. But the opposite happened. The further I moved along the timeline, the more frequently it appeared. Bone, copper, bronze, steel. Humanity kept making needles, perfecting them, wasting metal on them that, at the time, was worth more than gold. Why? Bone was perfectly fine for piercing leather. That meant the needle had gotten a new job. But what was it? I started looking for the exact moment when a bone needle was no longer enough. And that's where the investigation took another sharp turn. The answer turned up where I least expected it, at sea. I started looking into the first long-distance maritime expeditions, and almost immediately hit a new snag. You can build any ship you want, but without a sail, it won't get far. I looked closely at how sails were made back then. They weren't seamless. They were stitched together from dozens of separate panels of canvas. At first, I thought, why not just tie them together? I tested the theory. In a light breeze, it worked. But the moment a storm hit, the knots would cut into the fabric. The panels would shift. The sail would tear. It all made sense now. Sails couldn't be tied. They had to be sewn so tightly that dozens of pieces of fabric became a single solid sheet. And that's where I caught another detail. A bone needle wasn't cut out for that kind of work. The rough canvas would grind it down quickly. It would snap. People needed a metal needle, not for fancy new clothes, for sails. And without sails, the continents would have remained strangers to one another forever. Now the picture seemed complete. First, the needle helped humans survive the Ice Age. Then, it opened the way across the oceans. It seemed like that was more than enough to change history. I was ready to close the case, but one date made me stop again. The mid-19th century, the needle hadn't disappeared, quite the opposite. Right at that moment, it became more important than ever. Why? Metal needles already existed. People had known how to sew clothes for thousands of years. What could have changed? I started comparing needles from different eras. Almost identical. Same point, same eye. But one detail was different. It was so small, you could easily miss it. On a standard needle, the eye is at the back. On the new one, it was right next to the point. I double-checked the blueprints. No, it wasn't a mistake. Someone had intentionally moved the hole a few centimeters, and that single decision changed everything. At first, I didn't get it. How could one tiny hole affect an entire civilization? But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't a regular needle anymore. It was the key to a machine that would forever change garment manufacturing. For a long time, I couldn't figure out why move the eye. The needle worked perfectly fine without it. I started breaking down the mechanics of the sewing machine, piece by piece. And then, everything fell into place. A standard needle goes entirely through the fabric, along with the thread. Every single stitch requires a full motion forward and back. For a human, that's not a problem. For a machine, it's a bottleneck. It simply wouldn't be able to work fast. A needle with the eye at the tip works differently. It pierces the fabric, leaves a small loop underneath. A second thread immediately catches it, stitch complete. The needle doesn't have to pull the entire length of thread through the fabric. I paused, which meant the sewing machine would never have existed without a completely redesigned needle. I started looking for the fallout. It turned out to be far more massive than I expected. Before machines, clothing was sewn by hand, slow, expensive. Every garment required hours of labor. After the sewing machine, clothes were pumped out by the thousands. What used to be a luxury became commonplace. Factories grew. Cities expanded. Millions of people suddenly had access to cheap clothing. And for the first time in the entire investigation, I caught myself thinking a strange thought. The needle wasn't helping humans survive anymore. Now, it was rewiring the structure of civilization itself. I really could have closed the case there. The needle helped humans survive the Ice Age, cross the oceans, launch factories. I had my answer. And yet, one file wouldn't let me rest. The Apollo program. I couldn't figure out why it was even in this investigation. What was the connection between a sewing needle and the first manned flight to the moon? I opened the mission files and froze almost immediately. The photograph didn't show a rocket. It didn't show astronauts. I was looking at a woman sitting at a desk. On the table were thousands of tiny magnetic cores, ultra-thin copper wire, and an ordinary sewing needle. At first, I assumed the photo was filed here by mistake. But the longer I studied the documents, the clearer it became. She wasn't sewing fabric with that needle. She was manually threading wire through every single magnetic ring. That was how the onboard computer's memory was woven together. A stitch, a test, another stitch, another test, thousands of times over. And right then, I understood. This needle wasn't sewing clothes anymore. It was sewing the computational memory that the Apollo flight depended on. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Over tens of thousands of years, the world had changed beyond recognition. Man had learned to sail the oceans, build factories, create computers, fly to the moon. But one thing had barely changed at all. the needle. It survived the Ice Age, outlasted the age of sail, made it through the Industrial Revolution, and found its way into the space age. I looked back down at the very needle that started this investigation. 4 centimeters of steel, a point, an eye. I had been wrong. It was never just a tool for sewing. Time and time again, it solved the problems that made humanity's next step possible. I closed the case files. There was only one line in the report. The needle saved civilization. This time, I didn't try to argue with it.